Michael Cooper had always believed that a man's home was not simply four walls and a roof, but a living testament to everything he had endured and everything he still held dear. For him, that belief carried more weight than ever after the death of his wife 5 years earlier. Their modest house sat at the edge of a semi-rural township, far enough from the main roads to feel secluded, but still close enough to the city that the hum of distant traffic could be heard on especially quiet nights. Behind the house stretched a 2-acre piece of land that rolled gently downward to meet a narrow creek, a waterway that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Michael's late wife, Claire, had always said the creek was like the property's heartbeat. It was constant, soothing, and a source of life for everything around it. Deer often came to drink from it at dawn. Flocks of birds nested in the trees lining its banks, and the soft burble of the water became the soundtrack of countless evenings spent on the back porch together. When Claire had been diagnosed with cancer, those evenings had become even more precious. Michael could still recall how she'd rest her head on his shoulder, her thinning hair brushing his cheek, as they listened to the creek and pretended for just a little while that time had slowed. It was no wonder that after she passed, he had thrown himself into maintaining the property with the kind of devotion other men might have considered obsessive. Michael was a practical man, shaped by decades of work as a forest inspector before he took early retirement. He knew the rhythms of land, soil, and water the way others knew spreadsheets or sports scores, and though he was not sentimental by nature, the property had become his refuge. He tended the garden Claire had started, repaired the fences with his own hands, and learned the names of every tree and bush that had stood longer than he had. The creek, in particular, demanded careful stewardship. In summer, he cleared debris from its banks so the flow would not be interrupted. In winter, he kept a watchful eye on the possibility of flooding, though the old drainage systems installed in the neighborhood decades ago usually prevented any serious issues. He knew the health of the creek was tied not just to his land but to the ecosystem around it. If its path was obstructed, if its water became contaminated, the damage would ripple far beyond his own backyard. That knowledge gave him a sense of purpose in the years after Claire's death. It was something he could control, something worth preserving. The arrival of Victor Reynolds on the neighboring property changed the fragile equilibrium of Michael's world in ways he could not have predicted. The land next door had sat vacant for almost a decade after the previous owners, a quiet retired couple, had moved closer to their grandchildren in Florida. Michael had grown used to the empty lot. Its wild grasses and thickets of young trees acted as a buffer, giving him a sense of privacy he cherished. Then, one spring afternoon, he noticed a line of sleek black SUVs parked along the gravel access road and a group of surveyors hammering stakes into the soil. Within a week, heavy equipment had been delivered, and construction crews in bright vests began tearing up the lot. At first, Michael told himself it was none of his business. New neighbors were inevitable. He would introduce himself when the time was right, maybe even bring over a pie or a bottle of wine the way Claire would have insisted. But any hope of a friendly relationship evaporated the first time he met Victor. Tall, sharply dressed even at a construction site, and radiating the kind of confidence that made others instinctively step aside, Victor carried himself like a man used to getting exactly what he wanted. Michael had walked over to the property line one morning, intending to ask about the scope of the project and perhaps discuss the proximity of the excavation to the creek. Instead of a handshake or even basic courtesy, he was met with a thin smile and a dismissive wave. "It's all permitted," Victor had said before Michael could even finish his sentence, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "You don't need to worry about it. This is going to raise everyone's property values." Then he turned his back and barked an order at one of his foremen, making it clear the conversation was over. From that day forward, Michael kept a watchful eye on the activity next door. It was impossible not to notice how quickly the project escalated. What had begun as routine site preparation soon became something far more ambitious. Massive concrete footings were poured deep into the ground, forming the foundation of a sprawling house that dwarfed Michael's own. Trucks carrying prefabricated walls and steel beams arrived at all hours, their rumbling engines breaking the peace of the valley. Michael saw retaining walls go up near the creek's edge, their angular lines cutting into the natural slope of the land. He asked one of the laborers about it once, but the man only shrugged and muttered something about following the plans. The construction crews worked with an efficiency that suggested a tight schedule and a great deal of money. Michael tried to focus on his own life, but it was difficult to ignore the constant noise, the glare of floodlights that sometimes stayed on through the night, or the way the construction seemed to creep ever closer to his property line. He began noticing subtle changes in the creek. Its water, once crystal clear, occasionally carried a thin sheen on its surface, the kind that hinted at oil or other pollutants. Small fish that had been a familiar sight disappeared. He called the county's environmental office to report his concerns, but the overworked receptionist told him it would be weeks before anyone could send an inspector. By the time they arrived, she said, the issue might have resolved itself. There was another thing that troubled him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The crews seemed to operate with unusual secrecy. Tall panels of temporary fencing went up along the roadside, blocking any clear view of the work. Michael noticed that Victor rarely interacted with the workers directly during the day, preferring instead to arrive after dark in his luxury SUV. Sometimes Michael would catch the gleam of the man's headlights sweeping across his own yard as Victor drove slowly down the shared access road, as though inspecting the area for weaknesses. The few times they made eye contact, Victor's expression was unreadable, a mixture of cold calculation and something close to disdain. By late summer, the skeletal frame of the house had transformed into a monolithic structure with high walls and narrow windows that reminded Michael of a fortress. A vast garage had been built underground, and concrete trucks came and went for days as they poured its foundation. One evening, after most of the crews had left, Michael walked to the edge of his property and looked across the boundary at the construction site. He could hear the faint hum of industrial pumps working deep underground, presumably to keep the excavation dry. The noise was oddly unsettling, like the distant thrum of a heart he could not see. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that Victor's choices were his own concern. Yet, a part of him couldn't help but wonder what kind of man needed a garage big enough to hold a dozen cars, buried beneath a house already 3 times larger than anything else in the area. As the first hints of autumn colored the trees, Michael noticed something else. The ground around the creek was beginning to change. Areas that had always been firm were now spongy underfoot, and pools of stagnant water formed where the soil should have drained naturally. He brought this up during a casual conversation with a neighbor, but the man simply shrugged and suggested it was the result of unusually heavy rains. Michael knew better. He had lived on this land for nearly 30 years and could read its signs as easily as other people read books. Something had shifted, and he suspected it had everything to do with the massive construction next door. Despite his unease, Michael did not confront Victor again. He had learned that doing so only resulted in thinly veiled threats and accusations of meddling. Instead, he documented what he saw, taking photographs of the creek and its surroundings each week and noting any changes in a journal. It was a habit born from years of professional experience, the same method he had used when monitoring forests for signs of disease or illegal logging. He told himself that if the situation worsened, he would have evidence to present to the authorities. What he did not realize was just how soon he would need it. The first time Michael realized something was terribly wrong was a cold, rainy evening in late October when he returned from a trip to visit his sister in a neighboring state. He had only been gone for 5 days, but the transformation that had taken place during his absence was shocking. As he pulled into the long gravel driveway that led down to his house, the familiar soft gurgle of the creek was absent, replaced instead by a strange stillness. The sound of water was so ingrained in his daily life that its sudden absence was jarring, like walking into a room where a clock had stopped ticking. Michael parked his truck, grabbed his jacket, and made his way toward the back of the property with a growing sense of dread. The closer he got to the creek bed, the more he noticed things that didn't belong. The ground was saturated, muddy in places where it had never been before, and there were no fresh animal tracks near the water as there usually were after rain. When he finally reached the edge of the creek, his breath caught in his throat. The familiar stream of water that had run steadily through his property for decades was no longer flowing. Instead, a wide expanse of stagnant water had formed, pooling unnaturally along the banks and spilling into his garden. Where the creek once meandered, there was now a hard wall of freshly poured concrete blocking its natural course, a dam that cut straight across the waterway as if someone had deliberately severed the lifeline of the land. Michael stood there for several minutes in stunned silence, his boots sinking into the soft ground as the rain tapped steadily against his shoulders. He knew immediately who was responsible, but part of him couldn't believe Victor had actually gone this far. Blocking a natural waterway was not only illegal without permits, but it was also catastrophic for the land it supported. He took out his phone and began snapping photographs from different angles, making sure to capture the details of the new barrier. The smooth finish of the concrete, the fresh tire tracks leading from Victor's property, and the small excavator parked. On the other side of the dam, its engine still faintly warm to the touch. He walked along the boundary line, hoping to find some indication that this was temporary, but the structure was clearly permanent. It wasn't a minor modification or a half-hearted attempt at landscaping. This was a deliberate effort to divert the water entirely, cutting the creek off from the downstream flow. As he inspected the damage, Michael's frustration began to mount. The stagnant pools that had already formed were seeping toward his vegetable garden, and the soil in the lowest part of his yard was turning into a marsh. He could see how quickly the situation was deteriorating, and he knew it would only worsen with the heavy rains forecast for the following week. He walked up the slope toward Victor's property, ignoring the no trespassing signs that had been nailed haphazardly along the fence line. He wasn't there to make trouble, only to demand an explanation, but when he reached the gate that now separated their properties, Victor was already waiting for him. The man leaned casually against the post, dressed impeccably despite the weather, as if he had anticipated this confrontation. "Evening, Michael," Victor said smoothly, his voice carrying over the rain. "Back from your trip, I see. You're probably wondering about the work we did while you were away." "You destroyed the creek," Michael replied, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "The water isn't just for my property. It feeds half the land downstream. You can't just block it off because it's inconvenient for you." Victor's expression didn't change. He straightened slowly, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "The creek doesn't belong to anyone, Michael. It's not on any municipal records as a protected waterway, and it certainly isn't your personal property. What I've done is improve the value and usability of my land. I don't expect you to understand, but this was a necessary step for my project. The water was interfering with the foundation work, and I couldn't allow that to continue." "That's not your decision to make," Michael shot back. "There are laws about this. You can't divert a natural water source without permits, and even if you think you've found some loophole, this is going to destroy everything downstream. You're flooding my yard already." Victor gave a small shrug as though Michael's concerns were trivial. "I'm well within my rights, and as for your yard, perhaps you should invest in better drainage. It's not my responsibility to manage your property for you." The conversation was going nowhere. Michael could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, and for a moment he considered climbing over the gate just to confront Victor face to face, but he stopped himself. He had learned long ago that losing his temper would only work against him. Instead, he stepped back and took another series of photos of the dam from the property line, making sure Victor could see what he was doing. "I'm reporting this," he said finally. "You've crossed a line, Victor. I don't know who you think you are, but you can't do this and expect to get away with it." Victor's eyes hardened, though his smile never faltered. "Report it to whoever you like," he said calmly, "but I suggest you think carefully before starting something you can't finish. These kinds of disputes have a way of becoming Expensive. Michael turned and walked away without another word, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He could feel Victor's gaze on his back all the way down the hill. By the time he reached his house, the rain had intensified, and the pools of water in his garden were growing larger. He spent the rest of the evening documenting the damage, capturing the changes in the soil and the impact on his plants, but his stomach churned with unease. He had dealt with obstinate landowners before in his years as a forest inspector, but Victor was different. The man's confidence bordered on arrogance, and he spoke as though he believed himself untouchable. The following morning, Michael drove to the county office to file a formal complaint. He explained the situation to the clerk, showed her the photographs he had taken, and requested an inspection. She was polite but non-committal, explaining that these matters often took time and that an investigator would be assigned when one became available. Michael left the office with a stack of forms and the sinking realization that the system was not going to act quickly enough to prevent further damage. He reached out to the Department of Natural Resources next, hoping they would treat the obstruction of a natural waterway with greater urgency. The person he spoke to on the phone assured him that they would open a case, but they too warned that it could be weeks before anyone came to assess the site. That evening, as he stood on his porch and looked out over the waterlogged yard, Michael's frustration deepened into something darker. He could already see the toll the stagnant water was taking. The garden Claire had planted years ago was half submerged, the leaves of the plants yellowing and curling. He found the bodies of 2 young raccoons floating near the edge of the flooded creek bed, likely drowned when the water rose suddenly. He buried them quietly at the base of the old oak tree behind the house, the act filling him with a grim determination. This wasn't just about property lines or legal technicalities anymore. Victor had disrupted a fragile ecosystem, and the consequences were already playing out before Michael's eyes. He knew he would have to be smarter, more deliberate, if he wanted to stop the man from causing even more harm. Michael woke before dawn the next day, unable to rest as the reality of the situation sank in deeper with each passing hour. He knew from experience that once land and water were altered in such a way, the damage could accelerate quickly and become permanent if left unchecked. He had seen it during his years as a forest inspector when irresponsible development upstream would choke rivers or kill wetlands, leaving entire stretches of land ruined for decades. Now it was happening to him, right in his own backyard, and the bureaucratic system that was supposed to protect property owners and ecosystems alike moved at the speed of molasses. As he sipped his coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, Michael thought about the words Victor had thrown at him the night before. There had been no hint of fear in them, no acknowledgement that he might be in the wrong. Victor spoke like a man who had already decided there would be no consequences for his actions, and that realization chilled Michael more than the autumn air. By mid-morning, Michael was back at the county government center with every piece of evidence he could compile neatly organized in a folder. He had photographs, written observations, weather records showing that there had been no unusual rainfall to explain the flooding, and even a topographical map of the area highlighting the natural course of the creek. When his number was finally called at the permit office, the clerk, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, flipped through the documents with a practiced expression of detachment. Michael explained the situation again in meticulous detail, pointing out the illegality of obstructing a waterway and the danger to both his property and the surrounding environment. The clerk's response was maddeningly predictable. "Sir, I understand your concern," he said, sliding the folder back across the counter as though it contained something mildly unpleasant. "But Mr. Reynolds submitted a land modification permit several months ago. It was reviewed and stamped by the department, so as far as our records are concerned, his actions are permitted." Michael blinked, taken aback. A permit? Blocking a natural creek is not a minor modification. Who reviewed this? The clerk shrugged. "I'm not sure. The signature on the approval form is from an inspector named—" He squinted at the scanned document on his screen. "Richard Calloway. Looks like he signed off on it in July." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that name. Calloway had been a veteran county inspector for decades, one of the few who had consistently fought against developers cutting corners, but he had died of a heart attack nearly a year earlier. "That's impossible," Michael said, his voice low but edged with disbelief. "Calloway's dead. He's been dead for months." The clerk hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. "Well, I don't really know what to tell you, sir. The permit is in the system, and it's been approved. If you think there's been some sort of forgery, you'll need to file a separate complaint with our compliance division." Michael clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to stay composed. "And how long will that take?" The clerk glanced at the clock on the wall. "Probably a few weeks, maybe longer. They're very backed up right now." A few weeks. By then, his yard would be a swamp and the creek bed beyond recognition. He thanked the clerk curtly and left the building, his boots striking the tiled floor harder than he intended. As he stepped outside, he was hit by a bitter wind and the sinking realization that Victor had somehow managed to obtain forged paperwork granting him carte blanche to do whatever he pleased. Whether he had done it himself or had help from someone inside the county office didn't matter. The result was the same. Any official action to stop him would be slow and bogged down in red tape. Back at home, Michael inspected the damage again with fresh eyes. The stagnant pools in his garden were larger now, and the ground near the creek had become dangerously soft. He could feel it shifting under his boots, the way peat bogs did in the wetlands he had once surveyed. He worried that if the rains came again, his property could experience serious erosion or even a landslide. He made more notes, more photographs, determined to keep a record that would be undeniable. But a part of him knew that simply documenting the problem would not be enough. Late that afternoon, Michael decided to walk the perimeter of his property to see if there was any way to redirect the water temporarily. As he approached the boundary line near Victor's land, he noticed something new. A towering metal fence had been erected in just the past 24 hours, complete with a locked gate and motion-activated security lights that flared to life as he drew near. A small sign was bolted to the gate, warning in bold letters that trespassers would be prosecuted. Michael stepped closer, the harsh light washing over him, and saw a set of cameras mounted high on the fence post, their lenses tracking his movements. It was infuriating, but also telling. Victor clearly anticipated pushback, and he was investing heavily in ensuring that no one could approach his property without being seen. Michael backed away, trying to shake the sense that he was being watched, and returned to the house with his mind racing. That evening, he called an attorney he had once worked with on a forestry case, a woman named Susan Martin, and asked for her advice. She listened carefully as he laid out the entire situation, including the suspicious permit and the rapidly worsening condition of his land. "This isn't going to be easy," Susan admitted when he finished. "If the county records show that the permit is valid, even if it's forged, it gives Reynolds a shield. We can file an injunction, but it could take weeks to get a hearing, and we'd need hard evidence that the documents are fraudulent." Michael exhaled slowly. "What about the creek itself? It's being destroyed as we speak. Doesn't environmental law kick in?" "It should," Susan said. "But the agencies that enforce those laws are overwhelmed. If you want action quickly, you'll need to make enough noise that someone higher up takes notice. In the meantime, I'll start pulling the county's permit files to see what we can uncover. I'll also file a formal demand letter to Reynolds, but be prepared for him to ignore it. People like him usually do." After the call ended, Michael felt both grateful for her help and deeply unsettled by the reality of his position. He was a man with limited resources fighting against someone who seemed to have influence and money to burn. Victor had already taken steps to insulate himself from consequences, and the way he had erected that fence overnight made it clear that he was expecting a fight. As night fell, Michael sat on his back porch listening to the eerie silence where the creek's steady flow should have been. He thought about Claire and how much she had loved this place, how she would have stood by his side and reminded him to be patient and strategic rather than impulsive. that was what he needed now: patience and strategy. He would work with Susan to pursue every legal avenue available, but he also knew he had to prepare for the possibility that Victor would escalate the situation further. When Michael finally went to bed, he could not shake the sense of being watched. The glow of the security lights on Victor's fence cut into the darkness like searchlights, and the cameras seemed to peer into his property as though waiting for him to make a mistake. He closed the blinds tightly and lay awake for a long time, the weight of the coming battle pressing down on him like a physical force. The following week was an exercise in controlled frustration as Michael worked with Susan to push forward the legal process, knowing all the while that Victor was moving faster than any government agency could respond. Every day, trucks and heavy machinery came and went from the neighboring property, hauling in more materials for the underground structures Michael could not see, but could hear and feel in the vibrations through the ground. He could sense the scale of what Victor was building, something far larger and more complex than any residential garage or basement needed to be, and that suspicion only intensified his sense of urgency. He spent his days meticulously documenting everything, emailing photographs and detailed observations to Susan, who in turn sent a formal cease and desist letter to Victor. Predictably, there was no reply, though Michael did notice that one of Victor's men stood openly at the edge of the new fence line the day after the letter was sent, watching his house in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate him. One night, after hours of fruitless pacing in the kitchen, Michael decided to walk the creek's perimeter again, hoping to discover something that would give him leverage. The air was cool and damp, the kind of evening that would normally have carried the comforting sound of flowing water, but now there was only silence broken occasionally by the distant hum of pumps from Victor's property. As he traced the boundary, his boots sinking into the saturated ground, he noticed a patch of soil near the western edge of his land that seemed different from the rest. The ground there was softer, hollow in places, and when he pressed the toe of his boot into it, he felt the earth give way slightly beneath him. Kneeling down with a flashlight, Michael brushed aside the thick layer of wet leaves and discovered a rusted metal grate buried just below the surface. His pulse quickened as he cleared away more debris and revealed the outline of an old drainage system, one that had likely been installed decades ago when the neighborhood was first developed. He remembered reading about these systems in planning reports during his career, underground channels designed to redirect excess water from the creek into deeper soil reservoirs during heavy rains, preventing flooding in the lower properties. This one appeared to run directly under the boundary line and extended toward Victor's property. It had been neglected for years, perhaps even forgotten, but the structure was still intact. Michael realized that if he could restore its functionality, the water trapped by Victor's illegal dam could once again flow in its natural direction. The thought of it filled him with a renewed sense of purpose, but he also knew it was not something he could rush into blindly. He contacted a local contractor he trusted, a man named Henry Delgado who specialized in excavation and land restoration, and explained the situation in cautious, neutral terms. Henry agreed to come out the following afternoon to inspect the site, and when he arrived, Michael led him to the grate. Henry crouched over it, tapping the rusted metal with a small hammer and nodding slowly. "This is old, but it's solid," he said. "If we clear the channels and reinforce the weak spots, it should work again. But you need to know, this isn't a small job. It's going to take time, and it's going to cost money. And if your neighbor catches us digging this close to his property, he's going to raise hell." Michael weighed the risk in silence before answering. "Do it," he said finally. "I'll deal with the consequences. This is about more than just my yard now." Over the next several days, Henry and his small crew worked discreetly, often starting early in the morning before Victor's construction site became fully active. They used compact equipment to avoid drawing attention, digging out the clogged channels and installing new piping where necessary. Michael stayed close by, helping when he could and keeping watch for any sign that Victor's men might notice. The work was grueling, and every evening he felt the toll in his back and shoulders, but the progress was undeniable. Water that had been stagnating in the upper yard began to drain slowly through the restored channels, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt as though he was regaining some measure of control over the situation. Yet, even as the drainage system came back to life, Victor's actions grew more aggressive. He filed a counterclaim against Michael, accusing him of tampering with boundary infrastructure and demanding that all work stop immediately. The claim was baseless, but Susan warned him that it could delay their own injunction and that he needed to be very careful not to give Victor any grounds for a harassment complaint. Michael understood the importance of restraint, but it was becoming harder by the day. He could feel Victor watching him, testing him, and the pressure of that unspoken challenge weighed heavily on his mind. One evening, as Henry and his crew packed up their tools, Michael noticed unusual activity on Victor's property. Several large trucks had arrived after dark, their engines idling as men in dark clothing loaded and unloaded heavy containers into the underground garage. Michael stood at the edge of the woods, careful to stay out of sight, and watched as the containers disappeared into the earth. He had no idea what was inside them, but the secrecy of the operation and the sheer number of containers being moved made his stomach turn. Whatever Victor was building, it was not simply a luxurious home. It was something else entirely, something he did not want anyone to see. That night, Michael lay awake thinking about the drainage system and the timing of the next heavy rain. He knew he could not manipulate nature to suit his own plans, but he also knew that once the system was fully operational, it would restore the creek's natural flow. If the rains came and the water followed its historical path, it would no longer pool on his land, but instead follow the channel that now passed directly beneath Victor's underground structures. It was not revenge he sought, but balance, and yet he could not ignore the possibility that restoring that balance would expose whatever secrets Victor was hiding below ground. When the crew finished the restoration work the next day, Henry handed Michael a thick folder containing diagrams, photographs, and receipts, all meticulously documenting the project. "Keep this somewhere safe," Henry said. "If your neighbor tries to come after you, you'll need proof that everything we did was on your property and completely legal." Michael thanked him, aware that this documentation might be the only thing standing between him and a lawsuit down the line. As he watched the crew's trucks disappear down the road, he felt a flicker of hope, tempered by the knowledge that Victor would not back down quietly. The weeks that followed the completion of the drainage restoration were some of the most tense and exhausting of Michael's life, a constant balancing act between maintaining a semblance of normalcy and preparing for the inevitable retaliation from Victor. At first, there was a deceptive quiet, the kind that almost made Michael question whether he had miscalculated the neighbor's willingness to escalate. But then the small things began to happen, the kind of subtle provocations that were designed to unsettle without ever crossing a line that could be easily proven. He returned home one evening to find his mailbox knocked over and the letters scattered in the mud, though there were no tire tracks or footprints to suggest who might have done it. 2 days later, he discovered his truck had both rear tires slashed, the deep cuts in the rubber clearly intentional, but with no witnesses or security cameras on his property, he had no one to blame directly. The following week, his dog, a loyal shepherd mix named Boone, grew violently ill after wandering near the boundary with Victor's land. The veterinarian saved him with swift treatment but told Michael that Boone had ingested something laced with poison, a revelation that filled Michael with cold rage. Each time something happened, Michael documented it carefully, taking photographs, saving receipts, writing down dates and times, and forwarding everything to Susan. She sympathized, but reminded him that none of it would hold up as solid evidence in court. "He's trying to rattle you," she said during one of their late-night phone calls. "He wants you to make a mistake, to lash out so he can claim you're harassing him. Don't give him that opportunity. We're close to getting a hearing date for the injunction, but you have to stay disciplined." Discipline became Michael's watchword, though it felt increasingly fragile as Victor's construction project continued unabated. From his vantage point along the tree line, Michael could see that the underground garage had been completed, and a steady stream of vehicles came and went at odd hours. He often heard machinery running well past midnight, and there were nights when floodlights illuminated the entire site, turning the wooded landscape into a harshly lit fortress. The men who worked for Victor were no longer the standard construction crews he had seen in the early stages of the build. They were rougher, harder, the kind of men who carried themselves like they had been hired not just for their skills but for their willingness to intimidate. The situation reached a new level of hostility when Michael was served with a lawsuit claiming that his unauthorized excavation to restore the drainage system had damaged Victor's property. The claim was absurd. Every inch of the work had been done on Michael's side of the boundary, but the lawsuit was filed nonetheless, complete with photographs that Victor had somehow obtained of the drainage restoration. Michael could only assume that one of Victor's cameras had captured the work, though Susan pointed out that the photos were taken from angles suggesting the cameras were positioned illegally, possibly even on Michael's land. "We'll counter that," she assured him, "but this is going to delay things. It's exactly what he wants. He's buying time." Time was not on Michael's side. The fall rains had arrived in earnest, and with each passing storm, the ground on his property grew softer and more unstable. He could feel the weight of the trapped water pressing against the restored drainage system, and he checked it constantly, clearing debris and reinforcing the grates where necessary. Boone followed him everywhere now, never straying far after his near-fatal poisoning, and Michael took comfort in the dog's presence even as he worried about leaving him unattended. One particularly heavy storm in late November left Michael's yard looking like a battlefield. Branches littered the ground, and the water level in the flooded creek bed rose to its highest point yet. He spent hours outside in the driving rain, clearing the channel so the drainage system would not become overwhelmed, his hands raw and numb from the cold. As he worked, he could see Victor's property through the sheets of rain, the glare of security lights cutting through the darkness. At one point, a group of men emerged from the underground garage carrying large containers, their shapes obscured by tarps. They loaded the containers onto a waiting truck and drove off into the night, the taillights disappearing down the access road. Michael had no idea what the containers held, but the secrecy and timing of the operation convinced him more than ever that Victor was involved in something illegal. The next morning, Michael awoke to find a bright yellow notice taped to his front door. It was a stop work order issued by the county, instructing him to cease any unpermitted construction immediately. He stared at the notice in disbelief before calling Susan, who confirmed that Victor must have filed yet another complaint. "This is harassment," she said, her voice tight with anger. "I'll get it lifted, but it's going to take at least a week. In the meantime, you need to stay off that drainage system no matter what." Michael followed her advice, though it went against every instinct he had. He knew the system needed constant monitoring, especially with more rain in the forecast, but the risk of violating the stop work order and giving Victor more ammunition was too great. Instead, he poured his energy into gathering more evidence of Victor's activities. He purchased a pair of high-powered binoculars and began keeping a detailed log of the comings and goings on the neighboring property, noting the times and license plate numbers of every vehicle he could see. He also reached out to a contact he still had in the Department of Natural Resources, a man named Paul Ellison, who had once worked with him on a wetlands restoration project. Paul agreed to visit the property unofficially, promising to at least take a look at the dam Victor had built. When Paul arrived a few days later, Michael led him quietly through the woods to the edge of the creek. Paul examined the concrete barrier with a professional eye, running his hand over the smooth surface and shaking his head. "This is bad," he said. "He's not just diverting water, he's creating a hazard. If this fails, it's going to send a wall of water downstream. I'll do what I can to push this up the chain, but you should know the agency is stretched thin. They're going to want ironclad proof before they take any action." "I'm running out of time," Michael said, his voice low. "The ground is saturated. If we get another storm like the last one, something's going to give." Paul looked at him grimly. Then you need to be ready for it when it does. And keep your head down, Michael. I've heard things about Reynolds. He's not the kind of man who leaves loose ends." That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He sat by the window with Boone at his feet, watching the lights on Victor's property and listening to the distant rumble of machinery. He thought about Paul's warning and about the poisoned dog, the slashed tires, the poisoned land. He had tried to do everything by the book, to fight through legal channels, but Victor's wealth and connections had turned the system into a weapon against him. It was becoming clear that the only thing that might stop Victor was the very thing he had tried to control: the water. The rains returned with brutal force 2 nights later, a relentless downpour that pounded the roof and turned the yard into a quagmire. Michael donned his rain gear and went out into the storm with a flashlight, checking the drainage system even though the stop work order was still in effect. He could feel the pressure building as the water surged through the restored channels, the grates rattling under the force. He tightened the bolts where he could, knowing that if the system held, it would carry the water under Victor's property just as it had decades ago. At one point, as he knelt in the mud adjusting a section of pipe, Michael heard the distant growl of engines approaching along the access road. He turned off his flashlight and crouched low, watching as a convoy of trucks pulled up to Victor's underground garage. The men unloaded container after container, their movements frantic and disorganized, as though they were racing against the storm. Michael's heart pounded as he realized that whatever they were storing below ground was vulnerable to the same water he was fighting to redirect. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and Michael was soaked to the bone, exhausted but alert. The drainage system was holding for now, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the full weight of the water tested every inch of it. As he stood on the edge of the creek and looked toward Victor's property, he felt a strange mixture of fear and grim resolve. The balance of power was shifting, and the coming days would determine whether he could reclaim the land and the life Victor had tried to drown. The night that followed the storm was one of the longest and most harrowing of Michael's life. The rain had finally subsided by midnight, leaving only the steady drip of water from the trees and the occasional gust of wind. Yet, despite the calm, Michael could not shake the feeling that something was about to break, that the fragile balance he had fought so hard to restore was on the verge of tipping. He sat in the kitchen, staring out the window at the rain-soaked landscape, his mind replaying the events of the past few months like a movie he couldn't stop watching, each scene unfolding with greater urgency. For a brief moment he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, everything would hold together. The drainage system had withstood the pressure, and the channels he had cleared had begun to work as they were designed to. But that hope quickly dissolved as he noticed something out of place: movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was his eyes playing tricks on him, the trees and shadows blending together under the dim moonlight, but then it came again, the flicker of headlights cutting through the night. He glanced at the clock. It was well past 2 a.m. The sound of the vehicles grew louder, and through the rain-streaked glass Michael could see the familiar shape of a convoy of trucks making their way slowly down the access road that led to Victor's property. Michael's heart began to race. The storm had done what he feared it would. It had tested the limits of his work and of the land. The pressure of the water was immense, but he had believed it to be contained, moving beneath the surface and away from Victor's construction site. But now, as the trucks approached and the headlights swept across the yard, Michael realized with a growing sense of dread that Victor was about to take things even further. He grabbed his jacket and hurried outside, Boone trailing behind him, his dog's breath visible in the damp air. Michael moved swiftly toward the creek, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the path the trucks were using. He needed to know what Victor was doing, and he needed to know now. As he neared the boundary of the property, he could hear the trucks idling, their engines rumbling as men in dark clothing began unloading crates and barrels, the shapes obscured by tarps. It was the same activity he had witnessed before, the same containers being moved under the cover of darkness. His gut twisted with the certainty that whatever was inside those containers, it was something that should not be hidden, not on that scale, not in the middle of the night. Michael stepped cautiously through the wet underbrush, keeping his distance. But as he edged closer to the trucks, a sharp metallic sound caught his attention, something heavy being unloaded from one of the trucks. The men were working quickly, almost frantically now, and their whispered voices were laced with urgency. Michael crouched behind a large oak tree, straining to listen. "Get it underground, now!" a voice barked, low but firm. "We don't have much time before the system goes down. We need to move this before the runoff starts." The words made Michael's blood run cold. The system. They were talking about the drainage system, the one he had just repaired and redirected to bypass Victor's property. He couldn't afford to let them complete whatever they were doing, not now. He had to act, but with each passing second, the risk of being discovered grew. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Michael's head whipped around, searching for the source of the noise. It was then that he saw it. The large metal crate that had been carelessly dropped onto the ground, spilling its contents onto the dirt. And there, gleaming in the dim light, were plastic barrels marked with hazardous waste labels. The barrels were rolling toward the creek, the force of the spill sending them tumbling into the water. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. Victor was not just hiding illegal materials or building a mansion. He was using his construction project to cover up something far more sinister. He was dumping toxic chemicals into the very creek that fed the surrounding ecosystem. The water that had already been contaminated by the diversion of the creek was now being polluted on an industrial scale. Michael's mind raced. He needed to stop it. But how? There was no way he could confront the men without risking his life or alerting Victor, who would undoubtedly take measures to keep his activities hidden. Yet doing nothing wasn't an option either. If he didn't act now, the damage to the creek, to his property, and to the land downstream would be irreversible. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one had seen him before sprinting back toward the house. As he ran, he fumbled for his phone, hands shaking. He dialed Susan's number without thinking. When she answered, her groggy voice barely registered over the sound of the rain. "Michael?" "It's Victor," Michael gasped. "He's dumping chemicals into the creek, into the water that runs through my property. I need help, now. This is bigger than anything I can handle." "Where are you?" Susan's voice sharpened immediately, the sleep gone from her tone. "I'm at the property, but I can't do this alone. We need to get the authorities involved, someone who can stop him before it's too late. But we need proof. I've seen the containers. I've heard them talk about the runoff system. They're covering their tracks, but this can't be allowed to happen." "Stay there," Susan said, the urgency in her voice palpable. "I'll get the right people, but you have to stay safe. Don't do anything reckless." Michael hung up the phone, his pulse racing, and turned back toward the creek. His thoughts were scattered, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. He couldn't wait for the authorities to get involved. They were too far away, too slow. The chemicals were already in the water, and the runoff was going to carry them downstream, potentially into the very groundwater that fed the nearby town. A flash of headlights interrupted his thoughts, and Michael froze. A car was coming down the driveway, its headlights cutting through the trees. Panic surged in him, and he realized that if he didn't act now, he might lose his chance to stop whatever Victor had planned. The moment of hesitation passed, and Michael made his decision. He turned and sprinted toward the creek, hoping to reach the barrels before they could roll any further. By the time he reached the edge of the water, the men had finished unloading the remaining barrels and were securing the area, but they hadn't seen him. The barrels were just yards away from the creek, precariously perched on the edge. Michael dove into the water, grabbing the nearest barrel and rolling it back toward the shore, praying it wouldn't slip and spill. He struggled with it, the weight of the barrel nearly dragging him under the water, but he managed to get it back onto solid ground. The sound of footsteps splashing through the water behind him sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He spun around, heart racing, just in time to see one of Victor's men charging toward him. a crowbar raised in the air. Michael barely had time to react before the man swung it down, narrowly missing him. Michael ducked and dove for the nearest barrel, using it as a shield, but the man was too fast. He swung again, this time hitting the barrel with a sickening crack. The impact sent the barrel toppling into the water, and as Michael struggled to stay on his feet, the man advanced, anger flashing in his eyes. "Get away from the barrels, you idiot," the man shouted. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But Michael wasn't backing down. He lunged for the man, knocking him off balance and sending him tumbling into the creek. In that moment, something inside Michael clicked into place. The rage, the frustration, the sense of injustice all converged into a single, clear focus. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting to stop a catastrophe that could affect more than just his property. The man scrambled to his feet, but Michael was already moving toward the barrels again. He knew he didn't have much time. He had to stop them before they could dump anything else into the creek. The struggle that ensued was quick and violent, a blur of arms and legs as Michael fought to hold his ground. When the man finally stumbled back, Michael grabbed the crowbar from the ground and swung it toward him, knocking the man off his feet. Breathing heavily, Michael stood over the man, the crowbar held tightly in his hands. He glanced toward the creek, where the barrels floated dangerously close to the water's edge. He knew he had no time to waste. He couldn't fight this battle alone. But, for the first time in months, he felt a sense of control, knowing that he had at least taken one small step toward stopping Victor's destruction. As the man scrambled to stand, Michael backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked toward the trees, where the headlights of a car were now visible through the rain-soaked branches. It was Susan, coming to his aid. And with her, hopefully, the help he so desperately needed to end Victor's reign of terror before it was too late. The headlights of Susan's car cut through the rain-soaked night as she drove down the access road toward Michael's property, the tires of her vehicle crunching over the gravel in the heavy silence that followed the storm. As she pulled up alongside him, Michael could see the look of concern on her face, her expression quickly shifting to one of disbelief as she took in the scene in front of her. The barrels were still floating precariously close to the creek's edge, their hazardous contents leaking slowly into the water, the threat of a contamination now a very real danger. The confrontation with Victor's man had left Michael winded, but adrenaline still coursed through his veins, urging him to keep moving, to stop what had already started. Susan slammed her car into park and rushed over to him, her voice sharp with urgency as she surveyed the situation. "Michael, what the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the barrels and the debris strewn along the creek. "They've been dumping chemicals into the creek," Michael said, his voice hoarse from the struggle in the rain. "I don't know exactly what they've been storing in those containers, but whatever it is, it's toxic. And I'm not sure how long this has been going on, but if we don't act now, it'll be too late. This creek, it feeds everything downstream. If it's contaminated, there's no telling what the fallout could be." Susan nodded, her face set in grim determination. She glanced over at the truck where Victor's men had unloaded the barrels, and her gaze hardened. "This is bigger than just you and me, Michael. We need to get the authorities involved and fast. I'll make some calls." As she took out her phone and dialed the number for the local environmental agency, Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The reality of what they were up against had finally hit him fully. The water was rising, the chemicals were leaking, and Victor had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. But Michael knew that whatever came next, whatever steps they took, Victor wouldn't just back down quietly. The man had built his empire on bending the rules, and he wasn't going to let a little thing like legal action stand in his way. Susan's conversation with the environmental agency was brief but efficient. Within minutes, she had managed to get a team of inspectors mobilized, though it would take time for them to arrive. They had to prepare containment, gather the necessary equipment, and assess the scope of the damage, but it was clear they were coming. Michael didn't have the luxury of waiting, though. He couldn't afford to just sit and hope that the authorities would get there in time. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. He turned to Susan, his face hard. "We don't have much time," he said. "Victor's not going to stop. We have to make sure these barrels don't reach the water, and we need to find out what's in them." Susan hesitated for a moment, then nodded, determination settling in her eyes. "Agreed. Let's get to it." The two of them moved quickly, working together to drag the barrels away from the edge of the creek. It was harder than they expected, and the weight of the containers slowed them down. Each time they managed to pull one out of the water, they carefully rolled it further from the creek, placing it as far up the bank as they could manage. The cold rain continued to pour, drenching them both as they worked through the night, but neither of them slowed their pace. They couldn't afford to. By the time the authorities arrived several hours later, Michael and Susan had managed to move the majority of the barrels. The first responders were a team of men and women from the Environmental Agency, suited up in heavy protective gear and carrying equipment designed to handle hazardous materials. They immediately began assessing the situation, setting up a containment perimeter around the barrels and starting to test the water in the creek for contamination. Michael watched as the team worked, feeling a sense of both relief and anxiety. The worst of the immediate danger had been averted, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. One of the lead inspectors approached Michael, a man named Paul, whom he had met several times during his work with the county. "This is bad, Michael," Paul said, his voice low and serious. "You were right to call us. These chemicals are highly toxic, and they've already begun to leach into the water. We'll need to do a full analysis, but it looks like it's going to take a while to clear it up." "Victor," Michael said through gritted teeth. "He's responsible for this. He's been dumping these chemicals on his property for months, maybe longer. I have to believe that he's been planning something like this all along." Paul nodded slowly, his face grim. "We've already been in contact with the authorities. The sheriff's office is on their way, and the county's environmental enforcement team will be here shortly. We'll get a team out to investigate, but I'm going to need you to stay on the property. If Victor comes back, we need to document everything he does." Michael wasn't sure what he expected, but when the sheriff's department arrived several hours later, it was clear that they were prepared for a much larger operation than Michael had anticipated. There were several patrol cars, a few deputies, and a couple of officers from the county's environmental division. Everyone was set on handling the situation as efficiently as possible, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt like he was no longer alone in this fight. The officers began questioning Michael about the situation, documenting the barrels and the environmental hazards, but Victor's property was still heavily guarded, and the men who had been working there had disappeared. It wasn't until late that night that the first real breakthrough came. A man who had worked on Victor's construction project came forward anonymously, offering a tip. He had worked on the underground garage and the drainage system, but had quickly realized that something was wrong. The chemicals weren't just being stored for some industrial project. They were part of a much larger operation, one that involved land acquisition and environmental manipulation on a massive scale. According to the whistleblower, Victor had been using his development project as a cover for illegal dumping, manipulating the county's permits, and keeping his actions hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. Michael felt a sharp sense of vindication, but the information was also unsettling. Victor had planned this for a long time, using his wealth and influence to cover up his illegal activities. The revelation added an entirely new layer to the situation, and it was clear now that the stakes were much higher than he had initially believed. As the investigation into Victor's activities began to take shape, Michael and Susan found themselves at the center of a larger legal battle. They worked with the authorities to gather evidence, track down more whistleblowers, and ensure that Victor's toxic dumping would be fully exposed. The authorities moved quickly, and within weeks the full extent of Victor's criminal activities became public knowledge. Victor was arrested and charged with a range of crimes, including illegal waste dumping, environmental destruction, and fraud. His real estate empire, built on corruption and exploitation, began to unravel. The authorities moved to seize his properties, including the land he had used to illegally divert the creek. For Michael, the victory felt bittersweet. He had fought for his land, his home, and the natural environment that had once been a sanctuary for him and Claire, but the damage had been done. The creek would recover in time, but it would never be the same. The land, too, would heal, but the scars would remain. And as for Victor, his empire crumbled. But Michael knew that men like him always found a way to come back, to rebuild from the ashes.